Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm very glad that I had a possibility to come to this conference for the very first time and that I was accepted. And of course, this is my very first kind of attempt to try to do some research in young adult literature, which I'm personally really interested in trying to look at it as deep as possible. Today, this topic seems quite controversial and quite a taboo topic. Therefore, I will try to, merely just present the review or overview of how young adult literature depicted this particular subject throughout the history. And basically, I will be looking at Western literature, mainly because I've only started this particular research, and this is what I'm dealing with now. I have chosen a few novels for young adults by popular Western writers. This is not considered to be classical literature or elite literature, as we say. This is more a popular kind of literature which is extremely popular among young adults all over the world. And you would probably ask me why I'm talking about Western literature. Well, basically because the majority of these books are being translated or have already been translated into Lithuanian language. Therefore, I think it is quite important to analyze these books. To begin with, adolescence is a transitional stage of physical and mental human development that occurs between childhood and adulthood. This transition involves, as many critics agree, biological, social, and psychological changes. In the search for identity, adolescents are frequently confused about what is right and what is wrong. The period often is the time of confusion, growth, and change for young women and for young men. Therefore, it is often called the in-between stage or in-between period. There are many novels that were written for teenagers throughout many years and which basically deal with some problematic issues such as their parents, problems with peer pressure, their relationship with adults, with parents, with teachers, of course, with their own age group, first love, worlds, as well as many other topics that are considered often to be taboo, for example, as my topic today is sex. As a psychiatrist, Lind Ponton, who studied teenagers for 25 years, states that sexuality is a vital aspect for teenagers' lives and therefore it cannot be ignored. Nonetheless, sexuality and sex as it is have, and for the most part, are still considered to be some kind of taboo in books for young adults. The appearance of sensitive or taboo topics, as we call them, especially those connected with sexuality in books for adolescents, often shock adult readers and may be considered inappropriate in some ways, depending on the prevailing cultural norms of the society, of the particular society they're written in. It has been noticed that contemporary novels for young adults tend to touch on more and more sensitive topics. Therefore, it raises a question about the appropriateness of these books for teenagers. Of course, television, films, and video games aimed at teens gain a lot of attention for portrayal of sex, violence, and other controversial issues. And in the meantime, lately popular teen novels tend to often also be surprisingly sexually explicit, meaning that reading may not always be as this wholesome activity as adults may expect. The emerging sexuality that accompanies adolescence poses fundamental challenges for young adults. Societies, of course, greatly differ in cultural rules regulating sexual norms or sexual behavior. For example, because I'm looking mostly at the Western literature, and basically which is mostly the literature that was published by United States authors, despite increased social norms that actually became quite permissive since the 1950s, the fact that the majority of adolescents have sex and still adults consider it taboo or something that should not be talked out loud or for adults directly, despite, of course, different courses that are provided for young adults at schools, in the American schools, which are actually involved in the curriculum of their education, where sex education is being taught for them. But of course, usually the negative consequences are presented during these lessons, as we can call them. And of course, although we consider sex as something vital for people's relationships, usually when we talk about teenager sex, we often think about something negative, because we always think about teen pregnancy, premarital sex consequences such as sexually transmitted diseases, age, etc., etc., etc. As the well-known young adult nutrition specialist Michael Card states, there are many controversial topics in books for young adults. However, one area that he kind of presents that was most stubbornly resisted, such as taboo breaking, is human sexuality. Many adults seem to think that sex, if it's not mentioned for adults, for young adults, it will just simply go away, or they will somehow transit their way through it. The topic of sexuality is not that young, although it's not that young in young adult literature. And if we think about it, the very first book, of course there might be even more, but the very first book that is considered by many critics was written by the American author Henry Gregory Felsons, and it's called The Two and the Town. It was written in 1952, which actually depicted the sexual act itself, and mostly, of course, it talks about two young adults falling in love, having sex for the first time, and then the girl got pregnant, and they were forced to marry each other. Of course, here, once again, we see the negative consequence of sex. And his book at that time was very controversial because it was written in the 50s, as we see, at the time when the norm, the unwritten rule, was to avoid such subjects in books for young adult, or to talk about that as delicately as possible. According to Cart, 1967 was the period of the more realistic period, because there was a book by Anne Has, Mr. and Mrs. Bojo, where teenagers once again fell in love and had sexual intercourse, where the girl once again got pregnant and they had to elope. Still, these two books have something in common, because they did not focus on sex, on sexual act itself, but they mostly focused on the consequences after the intercourse. However, the situation has dramatically changed after probably one of the best known Judy Blume's novel Forever, which is considered to be kind of the celebration of sexual act itself by teenagers. It was written in 1975, and according to the U.S. children's book author Norma Klein, Forever was the first and hopefully not the last book to show teenagers that it was alright to have sexual relationship. And why the book was considered and is still considered and is one of the most banned books throughout the world, that teenagers in the book, they enjoy sex, and they say that it is okay to have sex, and there are kind of no norms or no regulations for them not to have sex. And as we see, the book was written in 1975. And of course, critics agree that not to include sex in books for contemporary young adults, when 48% of them admittedly have sexual intercourse, is quite strange. Of course, when we discuss the issue of sex in books for teenagers, we should remember that there are different kinds of sex that can be depicted in such novel. And I want to kind of show I'm not sure if you heard, but in 2002 there was a huge scandal in the United States of America when the famous TV show host Oprah Winfrey kind of started to talk about the oral sex epidemic that was happening in the United States back then. And we had this American author, Brigitta, who decided to write the very controversial novel in 2003 that was called Rainbow Party. And the title itself suggests that this was the so-called oral sex epidemic that was back then called the Rainbow Party. Teenagers were having those rainbow parties at home, and the idea was that the girls had to put on different kinds of lipstick in the party, and then during the party they had to portray oral sex on boys that gathered at that party. Therefore, Paul Brigitta decided to write a book about that, and of course, as most of these books, and the author itself said that I knew that this book will probably, even if it will be published for teenagers, it will receive a lot of different criticism and controversy. And of course, the book at first was decided not to allow it, to ban it, but basically, after many kind of discussions, it was decided to publish it and have it in libraries for teenagers, because the book itself does not depict the very act of oral sex, but it talks about teenagers who are preparing to have this kind of party at their house, and they're choosing all those different lipsticks, etc., and then talking about oral sex itself. So the book, well, we're talking here about 2003, 2002, and we have this one writer, Lewis, who said that it is actually not that surprising when we understand that this generation was raised on MTV, AIDS, Britney Spears, internet porn, and Monica Lewinsky, that we have those things happening in the world, and therefore they're transferred into books for young adults. Still, considering the more contemporary novels for young adults, it might be noticed that these books still often tend to show negative consequences for the girls who have sex in form of unpleasant sex or pregnancy or sexually transmitted diseases, HIV, or some emotional turmoil. For example, if we take a look at such novels as Marilyn Reynolds' If You Love Me, which tells a story about the girl who has her first sexual and only sexual experience when she's a teenager, and it results in contracting herpes. Or if we look at the very famous book by Anne Brashery's Sisterhood of Traveling Pants, where one of the protagonists also has sexual intercourse with her teacher, and then she goes through this emotional stress and emotional turmoil. The novel that also gained a lot of attention, the novel by John Green's Looking for Alaska. Of course, sex is not the main controversy or the main topic in this particular book, but it is one of the books that also was considered to be quite controversial and banned in some places because it was considered too sexually explicit, because it dealt with sex scenes, explicit sex, and oral sex as well, portraying of oral sex on teenagers by teenagers. And of course, the book was challenged for content. There are, of course, many other novels that tend to avoid some kind of hidden moral or criticism of sex or for the consequences after having sex when you're a teenager. And one of the books that was written by Daria Snadonovsky, The Anatomy of a Boyfriend, was written in 2008. And here we have a girl who is kind of curious as well about sex, and we do not have any kind of emotional consequences after that. She is also having sex, and the explicit sex scenes are quite obvious in the book. And the author herself, she said that she dedicated this book to Judy Blume, the first author who kind of tried to write about sex in a nice way without any bad consequences. When we talk about these books who actually glamorize sex, and well, we have to talk about the very popular book around the world, the famous Cecily von Ziegesar novels, The Gossip Girl. And of course, the Gossip Girl books, they present a contemporary picture of adolescent life, including explicit sex. Sex and the actual sex scenes in The Gossip Girl are often too glamorized. And it's shown that sex is fun, carefree activity, and it has very little consequence. None of the characters in The Gossip Girl are married, and one of the worst things is that the characters in the book, they constantly change their partners and they sleep with each other constantly. This is kind of the issue that is raised when we discuss the book. And if you analyze the novel, there are quite a few ambiguities that are quite strange. For example, the issue of losing one's virginity. And when you are a teenager, it raises quite many controversial questions for you, because for all casual, it is not good if you lose a virginity when you're a teenager, you are considered to be a bad girl. But then in some cases, for example, if we take one of the main protagonists in Gossip Girl, Serena, who loses her virginity to one of the boys, and then she does not remember who the boy was and when she actually lost her virginity. But then we have the other main character, Blair, who also loses her virginity to some boy in a limousine when she's drunk, and they're enjoying that. But then it is considered to be okay because throughout the story, it is constantly repeated that he is her man and they will someday spend their life together. So once again, if you compare the sex education lessons for teenagers in the United States, where it is said that it is not good to lose your virginity when you're a teenager and all the consequences are shown to you, and when teenagers read this kind of book, once again we see the problem here. Here sex is shown as something good, something free, something very glamorous and nice thing to do, and kind of fashionable or contemporary thing to do for younger adults. Of course, when we talk about these particular books, this is popular literature, and this is not considered to be something elite or something classical, and the literary value is very, very low. Even sometimes in this book we don't find any kind of literary value. However, the statistics show that the girls read these books in a huge rate, incredible speed, and these books are being translated into many languages. And for example, Gossip Girls, it sold over 5 million copies throughout 1 year. So, one of the other authors that is considered to be, or to have crossed the boundaries of the traditional young adult novel is probably one of the best known British authors, Ellen Burgess. And as card suggests, many texts which receive disapproval, the most disapproval from adults, are very often books that are most popular with teens, and this is the issue with Ellen Burgess, who is very popular among teenagers. And his novel Doing It, which was published in 2003, gained also a lot of criticism and controversy. Although Burgess, what's different with Burgess and the Doing It and the Gossip Girls is that he's trying to depict the reality of young adult sexual relationships, and the book is kind of presented in a humorous, nice way. And the other thing that he's talking about, boys' sexuality, not girls, because basically we find in all the majority of these books sexuality about girls. But here he's talking about boys, and he's presenting how boys are feeling and how they're dealing with being always constantly thinking about sex and thinking what they should or what they should not do. And why he was appreciated by young adults is that he often not only shows that, well, sex is only a pleasant thing to do for teenagers, but it actually shows, and also, once again, it does not show only the bad consequences, but it shows the actual process of being, how boys are actually dealing with their wishes and with what is happening to them during this transitional period. Therefore, many teenagers, not only boys but girls as well, kind of relate to him because he's being close to them and he's talking with them with their own language. Of course, here we have another problem: the language, too explicit, too vulgar, and too much sexual slang in the language. There have been many questions and issues discussing what is considered to be the norm nowadays in young adult literature, and the only thing is clear that young adult literature goes hand in hand with the social changes, with the changes in popular culture. Sex is so openly glamorized in today's culture that it seems almost inescapable for young adults. And of course, young adults' main sources for information about sex include internet, television, films, music, video games, magazines, and the depiction of sexuality in these media sources is what teens perceive to be the truth. Therefore, the changes of sexual content in teen fiction is hardly surprising. It came with much wider changes in media and society and the image of adolescence. Most sexual behavior on television takes place between unmarried adults and ignores the potential negative consequences of sexual intercourse. Music video often combines sex and violence, which is also considered to be very negative for young adult development. And the thing is that adolescent, or as I very admire Australians calling it, the crossover literature, has become a major publishing phenomenon in the world lately, with more and more books aimed at teen audience being published each year. The current books for adolescents are more interesting for teens, as they tend to deal with the realities, some very complex and difficult that teens have to face nowadays. And as I've only chosen a few books kind of to show the basic idea how sex is being depicted, and we saw that some writers see it still try relating to some negative consequences, others try to make it as glamorous as possible. just kind of to get this, or to prove the idea that sex sells, even for young adults, or, as in Burgess's situation, we have some more realistic presentation or depiction of sex. And the change in popular culture, changes in society make writers to push this envelope. However, it then raises the question, do things that are written in books for young adults nowadays really represent the reality of young adult life? Sex does not seem to be a taboo in books for young adults in Western countries, and we see the writers are becoming braver regarding the issue as well. However, it's something that was not supposed even to be mentioned or depicted previously or a long time ago, now has reached a stage when it should actually be more carefully looked at and discussed among adults. Surely there's more talk about the issue of sex itself, because it is, as it was said, inescapable and it cannot be simply ignored by writers. But the thing is, and the thing that probably I'm mostly concerned is that many of these books are turning into something simply too casual, something too simple, too glamorous, too nice, and we can have casual partners, we can have casual sex, casual relationships, and still we actually have little value, and the majority of these books have little value, and I think that therefore we need to take a look not only at the books for adolescents that have good value, that are being treated as classical or well written, but also these books that are kind of considered to be popular literature because these are very popular among young adults.